the touch of your hand.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me? So we're going to get started as people keep trickling in. Thanks everyone for joining us today on behalf of Printed Matter. I'm excited to introduce our program today with Tiffany Shaw and Virgil B. Taylor. We actually hosted last February, when we could still gather in person, the leaked preview of this book with Tiffany. And since then, we've been able to see it grow and transform, adapting to a changing reality and culminating in this really thoughtful and informative book. We're going to start with a reading and performance of the text from Tiffany, followed by a conversation with Virgil on the design of the book. If you have any questions throughout, just direct them into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we can address them near the end of the program. You can also purchase the book on our website, so I'll drop the link to that into the chat in a moment. Too Salty, Too Wet is an oral history of tears, geography, necromancy in and outside of Hong Kong. It's a hellish scroll that attempts to catch up to the front lines of history. Inspired by thread-bound books of martial arts secrets, it's a bastard text and an assemblage of lyric that confronts news addiction, performs an exercise of breath and optical training, and holds a light to occult unrest, asking the question, how must we summon the invisible? Tiffany Shaw is an artist, filmmaker, and founder of Speculative Place. She is the author of Salty Wet, a series of anti-travelogues on smut, affect, and the history of Hong Kong, a chapbook in the disguise of vintage softcore porn magazine published by Inpatient Press. Shaw is the director of the short experimental film Never Rest, Unrest, which screened as part of a retrospective in the Propositions program at Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival. She's also part of Home Cooking, an artist collective founded by Asad Raza, on which she contributes a performance and reading series Hell is a Timeline. Virgil B.G. Taylor is based in Beacon or New York or London or Bremen or Berlin. He makes fag tips, an online speculative zine. His work explores histories of care and crisis, magic and toxicity, and he is one half of a study friendship with Ashkan Sepavand, and a member of What Would an HIV Doula Do, a collective of artists, writers, caretakers, activists, and more gathered in response to the ongoing HIV/AIDS pandemic. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tiffany. Again, if you have questions, just direct them into the box, and Tiffany and Virgil can get to them after their conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this event, even for those of you who are tuning into this video after it's been posted. Thank you to Printed Matter for having me and Virgil on this talk for the launch of Too Salty, Too Wet. Thank you especially to Anna Collins for your huge help in setting all of this up, and also to Margaret Stern for Zoom assistance, and Craig Mathis for receiving these books, and bibliographer Leslie Leceder for processing these books at Printed Matter. And also thank you to Yu Chen and Emmy for your support since last year. I'm going to first begin with a trigger warning. So much of this talk and reading is going to be about violence and various forms of and distance and proximity to violence. I'm currently at my parents' place in Eastern time, sitting in my dad's office. For the visually impaired, I am wearing a navy short sleeve shirt, although you can't really tell, it could be black, over a sheer long sleeve shirt. My short bob is pulled up partially. Behind me is a bookcase under a glass cabinet, which stores thread-bound scrolls, tea sets with 2 porcelain figures at the top showing Chinese deities, which if prompted later in the Q&A, I will tell you about them. Through this reflection of the glass, you can also see the glow from the monitors in front of me. I like to be mindful at the beginning of these talks on the duration in which I demand people to look at screens. Just to give you an idea of the time and length of this talk, I'll be reading and speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes. Virgil and I will then transition to speaking about the design of the book and also sharing notes by Jonathan Yu on the calligraphy for the book, which was commissioned. The program will be an hour and a half total with a Q&A at the end. So do not feel pressured to stare at the screen the whole time, and I will be sure to prompt you to return to the screen when we are doing things like screen sharing. I suggest that you sit near a window so you can look outside during this talk, even if it is dark. I'll begin first with the cover of Too Salty, Too Wet. For those of you who have it, can hold it in your hands as I'm describing this to you. After posting images of the book, a lot of people's comments were that it was a pretty and beautiful book. But in fact, the meaning of the reflective foil material will change over time. Mylar is the material of emergency. I was given 2 pieces of Mylar by a frontliner to cover my mask, and they sat on my desk for a year as I wrote this. This was used during the protest as a kind of folk infrastructure for anti-doxing. Mirrors were also used at front lines as a kind of performance that staged reflection at the line against police. This is not just in Hong Kong, and similar uses of mirrors against police have been seen with Ferguson protesters facing off with Oakland police and Ukrainian protesters against the Berkut. Mirror shields were also used at Standing Rock by water protectors who held up mirror shields at the front lines. And Mylar as material for blankets are used at borders by migrants in detention centers, becoming a symbol of the US-Mexico border crisis. And one-way mirrors feature in interrogation rooms. Front lines have become sites where the mirror intervenes as a, quote, reappropriation of riot gear, as activist and gender studies scholar Melissa Nasrallah describes, but are materials repurposed into resistant folk infrastructure. This cover, like the first Salty Wet, is not what it seems. The mirror here is not so much about vanity or simply self-reflection. It is also a warped mirror by design. Impressions, dents are meant to be part of the book. They will accumulate over time. The reflective jacket, each marked uniquely by streaks, makes known the process of printing, shipping, and various places the book will move through, the exchange of hands. It will catch dents and imprints like skin, and over time, the oil of your fingers will build its own smudge. For a book about ongoing and historical trauma and scaling affect and the body in history, this Mylar has connotations of the use of Mylar in resistance, but is also a metaphor for the porousness and vulnerability of the body that lives through these times. This material does not forget any dent that you make upon it. I'll take this cover apart now. This functions that you can see this. So you can see this repurpose of this foil jacket. And I can actually see through it. I can see out, but you can't see in. To reference the film Empty Metal, directed by Adam Khalil and Bailey Schweitzer, privacy is not a right. It is not even an instinct. It has to be taught by people. Too Salty, Too Wet, Gung Ham, Gung Sup is an intentionally bad translation. Ham Sup means perverse in Cantonese, or perverted, but literally translates into salty wet. Gung Ham, Gung Sup means even more perverse. The English title began as a joke with Ed Halter about the sequel to the zine. And by the way, I still haven't seen Too Fast, Too Furious. The first Salty Wet, Ham Sup, poses the relationship between longing, belonging, erotics, and protest. But contrary to the title of the book, which in Cantonese means even more perverse, Too Salty, Too Wet is about the deadening of erotics and eros in the time of trauma and upheaval. It is foremost about how the spectacle makes a perversion of lived events. I think people expected me to write a book about the relationship between eros and protest, the libidinal political energy, the swolerati, or even the myriad ways in which thirst showed up in politics, which will become part of other projects upcoming. One example of this was how compilation videos of police brutality in Hong Kong were uploaded and distributed and smuggled via Pornhub to raise awareness. Quote, Hong Kong protesters getting fucked by police, unquote. But there was nothing erotic about that time. And with alleged rapes of prisoners in Hong Kong, it felt disgusting with everything that was going on to pose eros alongside processing intense trauma that offered no space for joy or agency or consent. I could begin by discussing love and longing as some metaphor for belonging to Hong Kong, but it would be remiss to the dangers of political allegory, supposing relationships with your birthplace play out like attachment theory, as if Hong Kong was a lover or a parent. In these months, it is perhaps not an accident that some of the worst, most out of touch, often statist narratives invoked metaphors about belonging to one's country by likening it to a relationship with one's parent or a lover, or even likening colonialism similarly. Attachment was used as a coercive weapon. Many pieces were offered up or labeled as love letters to Hong Kong. I reject this notion of a love letter. Instead, I turn to the scroll as an unrelenting form to show our times. The scroll in its myriad iterations, either as the Twitter timeline, cinema as a celluloid scroll, to how live streamers move, to ancient scrolls is a vernacular through which we intake massive amounts of complex information. And before I begin reading, I'll just talk a bit about the title. Too Salty, Too Wet is about crying. So much of this writing was born from insomnia, crying, and dread. And in the thick of the editing process, I created a ritual of crying induced by singing to work through this text. And the hardest part was having to revisit the scenes of trauma and edit them to make them grammatically correct in English and understood. How to make good writing out of pain. And maybe I fail. Sometimes after pushing this out, I would be debilitated for days. There is indeed something preposterous about writing about crying, like Roy Orbison singing a whole song about it. It is declarative. I have been crying over you, and then he goes on and on, left me standing all alone, alone and crying, and then on, I'll be crying. Yeah, crying over you. And you wonder if he's indulging in crying as a performance and making such a grand statement of his sorrow. Crying becomes an appeal. A friend read an early draft of this text, and I had reworked it so many times I knew there was a sense that I didn't want this text to hit you with a sense of distance, that if I created that it was written with cliches about the front lines, it would fail, because it would make you numb to it. I wanted this text to hurt because I was hurting. But what are the ethics of hurting the audience for whom you are writing for, other Hong Kongers, other people who have been through similar experiences on variations of these front lines, some more violent, some lasting not as long, some lasting longer and current. I want to convey something I desired during those months, to feel seen, for some kind of recognition in text. So I'll do something which is a bit of an experiment with this text. It's created as an assemblage anyway. There's no linearity to it, although I reworked it and worked it multiple times to create the flow that it has. I'll read a series of excerpts backwards from the end of the text to the front to reassemble the assemblage. With some skipping around, I will weave a different linearity, kind of goosebump style, if you will. I love that this can potentially spoil the text reading it from end to beginning. So I will let you know when I'm done, and then we'll switch over to Virgil, conversation with Virgil. This text is printed and completed as a work of perfect binding. What you now hold in your hands is a ubiquitous softcover book binding method whereby pages and the cover are adhered together at the spine with a strong and flexible thermal glue. This form deviates from its original plan as a text to be printed as a thread-bound scroll, invoking the style of scrolls on which martial arts secrets would be printed and distributed. Thread-bound binding, no longer available in Hong Kong, can only be done at scale across the border. This last-minute change to the method of binding came to the binder, who refused based on its contents, raising concern about the risk of exporting these books, since at customs, every shipment is unpacked and inspected at the risk of being destroyed and censored. There could have been myriad reasons for this refusal, which was a swift decision, including potentially the most preliminary fact, the obscene-sounding title. This text arrives to you not in its originally intended form, but presents the process of printing as an illumination. Where are the front lines today? Tun Git means solidarity or unity, literally comprising of two words, Tun meaning group and Git denoting knots. For a leaderless movement, it is impossible to describe its totalities posthumously, and there are many disparate, nuanced, and also intensely oppositional parts of this total. But we are entangled, thread-bound, and knotted in relation. The thread that was meant to bind the book together is felt in its absence. This is a bastard text. Legitimacy is also the question of who gets to speak for a place or write about its history. I am not indigenous to Hong Kong, yet in orbit around this place even after emigrating. I was born here and became naturalized as a citizen elsewhere. My family became entangled with Hong Kong through a series of displacements. Indeed, there is a paradox in asking who is, quote, local, who is a local voice in a place where historically people sought political refuge and where most are not indigenous. Who are the legitimate or illegitimate children of a place? Along the river during the Qingming festival is a scroll painting from the 12th century by the Song dynasty painter Zhang Zeduan. Over 5 meters long, the scroll occupies a monumental place in Chinese art history and has sparked centuries of copies, reproductions, reinterpretations, elaborations, including the Harcourt Village Scroll, which depicts the occupied area that lasted 75 days during the Umbrella Movement in 2014 and published in 2015 as an unfolding accordion scroll. Zhang's original depicts life in the capital of Bianjiang on the holiday of Qingming, a day of tomb sweeping, paying respects and performing rites to the dead. Zhang reveals the town as an unfurling, continuous image of multitudes, rural and urban scenes from across classes, with all kinds of varying architecture and roads. The scroll reveals each new subscene as it unfurls, and among them, a ship in danger of crashing into the bridge it is trying to cross under, peddlers at the center of the town, official scholars riding into the town center, a farmer in the distant outskirts pulling a daisy chain of oxen along. The painting's perspective affords a viewer into the distance. Zhang affords the beholder an omnipotent point of view, but we are used to this perspective now. It is the eye of the drone, of surveillance. When I was volunteering as a redacted, I knew well the circuits of the overpasses that ran from Central to Causeway Bay. They weave through office buildings, malls, hotels, across tram stops, roadways, and perpendicular to the harbor front. I spent so many angsty summers wandering these circuits as a teen, smoking cigarettes and listening to music alone. Intuiting these networks, it was easy for me to outpace the cops and always follow the front lines from the overpass. And upon these vistas, these scenes came into lucid, distant view. Cinema is a celluloid scroll, and in its quintessential expression, a long take that dollies across space, showing a scene's continuous image. Similarly, ancient Chinese scrolls, although continuous, can be parsed into a series of subscenes. Over Harcourt, water cannon, tear gas, projectiles, an assault of less lethal weapons on civilians, and amidst the scene of contemporary civil conflict, this is indeed a hell. And it is the quintessential vision of the Hong Kong protests and the image of conflict that journalists wanted so badly to capture. Journalists lunged across the front lines with their cameras, capturing the conflicts close up, but zoomed out, the display surfaced as a diorama and dichotomous choreography of assault and resistance. Gear in a supply line moved to the front. Hand signals communicated for first aid assistance. Dozens of bodies crouched underneath umbrellas, strapping in their helmets and gas masks. Simultaneous actions moved in flow. And amidst this, a small body in the crowd was writing in spray paint words onto the pavement of the overpass, moving with others who were covering his body with umbrellas, his movement partially obscured. The spray of the paint underneath his body committed onto concrete the words, redacted, 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 redacted. Each stroke, arms swinging, crawling over the ground with each written character materializing underneath him. These authorless and prolific acts of graffiti or writing occurred alongside direct action. These words would be redacted and painted over only a day later. The city is so cruelly efficient, but the writing in this moment is a practice of occult poetics. It summons the disappeared into the realm of the visible. Zhang's ancient scroll shows the town on the day of Qingming, the day of tomb sweeping. Alongside the people of the town, bustling, are the invisible souls who live alongside the living. It is a day of heavy traffic of the dead who visit their relatives, some unattended who are wandering the streets in eternal restlessness and agony. These souls are invisible on the scroll. If indeed spirits exist, those of dead dissidents are the indefatigable energies who have haunted our timelines and who continue to haunt. Liu Xiaobo wrote, "When we think about the victims who harvested nothing, indeed, whose gains were only negative numbers, do we feel no personal responsibility, no guilt? Should we not observe minimal standards of human decency and with that same passion with which we cherish freedom, be sure that the normal resources that derive from the loss of human life, which are the only resources people have in challenging totalitarian power, are properly apportioned," unquote. And if indeed human life is the most potent resource of resistance against authoritarian power, and perhaps the only resource that guards against it in direct action, do we not then summon the dead, our approximate angels of history? In protest, we observed a collective effort of ancient occult practice. The true foreign influence is that of ancient ideas. These restless souls are the spirits who died in vain and whose eternal state is unrest. Losing my place. 1 second. My dad recounting the day that he met my mother after the Hong Kong riots in 1967. The riot in Hong Kong happened in 1967 and Hong Kong was in turmoil. My parents were discussing their options to leave for Malaysia or Taiwan. When it had quieted down, my father took up a job and left for Singapore in 1969. He worked there for 2 years as an operations manager for a company manufacturing men's undershirts. Due to the pressure to make something of myself in those years, our relationship took on a formal exchange of letters, and I would write to him on weekdays, briefing him on my days. And one day, I received a letter telling me to visit a new friend whom he made in business. He also mentioned that this man had a daughter, the kind of girl that he would like to see me end up with. I went to visit this person in haste, but my interest was more in his daughter for obvious reasons. I called to arrange a meeting with him, and I was told to go to his apartment. I arrived on time and was received at the door by a girl dressed in cheongsam. She led me into the living room to meet her father. I hadn't been to a home with so many girls. They filled up every corner of the room and took up every seat. He had 10 daughters. Soon I was led by the man whom I called Mr. Wong, and he told me to ride with him in his car to visit his factory. It was a Sunday afternoon. We went all the way to Guntong, and he turned the radio up so loud while trying to carry on a conversation with me. I entered a textile factory for the first time, where I saw braids being made on cast iron machines and labels being woven with wooden shuttle looms. It was hot, noisy, and dirty. I accompanied him back to his home, but parted with him before entering the building of his apartment. Although he invited me to go up again, I politely declined, as the day had gotten too overwhelming for me. Cities have died throughout history, or conversely, empires have killed them. Salting the earth is the idiom for desecrating a conquered city and rendering its land arid and uninhabitable. It is said that the Romans killed Carthage this way, but this is untrue. As Ronald T. Ridley describes, salting the earth is a mere contamination from the history of other places, lesser known in our contemporary imagination of ancient cities of the, quote, Near East, like Hattusa, Arina, Hanusa, that were killed in ritualistic fashion. When captured and destroyed, these places were sown with minerals and plants, including cress, sipu, cadimus, which were salt-like in their composition to erode and henceforth curse these places' hopes for future re-inhabitation. Unlike Carthage, those ancient cities have been overlooked in the popular imagination, and their geographies are part of a global mythos of dead cities. To be sure, Hong Kong will remain habitable, but for a place where people have historically sought political refuge, for whom the city is habitable, it will change. It used to be a privilege to leave, but for those already in exile, fearing arrest if they return, and some even excommunicating their families to protect them, their abrupt departure from Hong Kong marks the loss of their home they can never return to. Mourning Hong Kong also reckoned with an anticipatory kind of grief for a loss yet to come. Has the end happened? Is it occurring now? Naming the end is a speculative effort. People have different opinions of what constitutes an end, and the experience was uneven. For those who couldn't refute the death of Hong Kong, the circumstances of their lives evidenced the end. Many saw no future for their children here and were planning to emigrate or encourage their kids to. Some were jailed or charged and waiting sentencing. Some were disappeared. Some already fled Hong Kong as exiles. Others didn't see it as an end, but as a beginning. Life still goes on and will, of course, continue for those who choose to stay. There was a sense that mourning, or even calling this the end of Hong Kong, foreclosed a possibility for the future or for life in any way, especially the potential for resistance. Yet no one has the power to end a contract with grief. Denial is part of its process. Categorizing a feeling does not foreclose its futurity. A profound sense of loss emerged regardless of our refusal to call it the end or the death or mourning. Naming grief has the power to legitimize a common pain, and to do so isn't to claim a sense of defeat or negate the possibility for life to flourish or resistance to take new forms, but rather to give language to an invisible system of feelings in which we live. It holds a light that guides our everyday experience, which is only felt somatically before language gives it the power to enter the written record. It brings pain and suffering into visibility in its best approximate name. We are, quote, mourning, unquote, a city. Crying or sorrow alone is not newsworthy, so Bart's words called out to me like a dare. Historical transition reconfigured us upon these individual private sites of feelings, grief, anger, and even denial. To write the history of tears is to document an oral history of sorrow, and these times breathed a spirit with its own momentum in each of us. This spirit ruptured how we experience the day-to-day. It ripped apart relations and built new ones. It questioned and reconstructed notions of normalcy. Marcuse writes that in protesting, the intellectual refusal may find support in another catalyst. It is their lives which are at stake, and if not their lives, their mental and their capacity to function as unmutilated humans. Their protest will continue because it is a biological necessity. Sorrow fueled the very fire that galvanized us, burning somatic inscriptions of pain and illness. I cried often in those months, holding my phone in my hands at night. We all cried, and it was as if during these months, each person observed grief take over our body as hosts. To document sorrow was to make trauma visible and to illuminate the somatic narrative that wove through and connected us. It was to tell the gulf between the spectacle and our experience as lived. I never met my paternal grandfather. I was born just a few years after he died, but I heard about his interrogations, which occurred nightly from when a car picked him up at 8 p.m. and dropped him back off at his house at 8 a.m., and the ulcer that formed in his stomach thereafter, which plagued him for the rest of his life. Historical narratives play out in our bodies. Our bodies tell history's most violent ruptures. Fear now began permeating the logic of all action, from very visible actions like joining a protest, more banal forms like second-guessing, packing saline in your bag on your commute in case you could be searched. Your mind takes a journey along a daisy chain of possible outcomes wherever you are. On the subway, you visualize a list you could be on. From the front lines, you picture being arrested. Half asleep in your bed, you wonder if you hear a knock on your door at night to search your place. You think of the disappeared and where they are now. This experience is not rational. The evening door knock echoed from my grandfather's time. I am a child of the Pearl River Delta. I was born in Hong Kong in 1988, 9 years before the handover. While my family is not indigenous to this territory, my lineage tells a series of accidents and violence that led to our arrival here. My great-grandfather was likely the first person in my family to touch the Pearl River Delta. He was one of 3 brothers shipped to Malaya and sold as piggies, as the literal translation of my Juzai goes. My father described how an agent, quote, recruited his grandfather growing up poor in Fujian and traded him in a package deal along with 3 brothers. My comprehension of this story changes depending on whether my father tells the story in Cantonese or writes it in English, which he had been doing for a year as a daily writing practice of committing our family history to words, offering a page every day, which he emails to my mom, my sister, and I. In English, my father wrote that his grandfather worked to earn his freedom. Was he a slave, I asked. He refuted this term and asked if his grandfather was an indentured servant. Perhaps, but it only took me wading through historical writing to begin asking what my Juzai truly meant in English. I knew that as the police increasingly disregarded the camera's presence, they willingly constructed a theater of terror that played out weekly to discourage people from protesting. It also seemed no coincidence that rumors such as photoshopped pictures of military encampments along the harbor front or high production videos of PLA drills were typically distributed later in the weekdays leading up to the weekend of protests. They planted seeds at opportune moments to sow fear. Instead, these scenes and videos have served, as Evan Calder Williams has described as, quote, their explicit display as spectacles of trauma designed to shame the dead, warn the living to stay in line, and entertain those who gained from the enterprise. Williams describes this as part of the system of racial capitalism, and this spectacle broadly also goes by another name, the political theater of terror, and it is the texture of the police state. Acts of torture perform pain as a theater for its prisoner, as Elaine Scarry states. It is not accidental, quote, it is not accidental that in the torturer's idiom, the room in which the brutality occurs was called the production room in the Philippines, the cinema room in South Vietnam, and the blue-lit stage in Chile. Scarry goes on, but whatever the regime's primary weapon, it is only one of many weapons, and its display is only one of many endlessly multiplied acts of display. Torture is a process, and yet these acts are largely invisible to the public. On live streams, these beatings of civilians are bold and overt. You are the audience for whom the violence is performed. In the timeline that we live, a smartphone, tablet, or computer screen is itself a kind of scroll. Its very interface design animates form into action. Information unfurls relentlessly under your finger. Ancient hand scrolls contain multiple illustrated scenes or a singular moment in time, or a consecutive narrative along a linear trajectory. One unfurls the scroll panel by panel at shoulder width. Viewing is an intimate act. Panel by panel, an apocalypse is a revelation. Our daily feed shows us these times in bare terms. Hell is not a place. Hell is a timeline. The shortest distance to the front was often the live stream. Zekbo means live stream or live broadcast, literally translating as straight or linear broadcast. Events arrived before us through these streams without editorialization. Unless the entire scene is staged, live streams cannot yet be faked. A live stream moves with a body. The feed shakes synchronically to each step, recording at times the breathlessness of the person holding the device as they run to capture the critical moment. We watched them while eating dinner. I often observed people viewing live streams even while being adjacent to the front lines. Hong Kongers were glued for months on end to live streams. Even the English word itself adapted into conversations in Cantonese. As though viewed through an RPG role-playing game, we watched these live streamers get pepper sprayed, beaten, chased, kettled, and tear-gassed. When we watched these streams, we heard their voices narrating the events before us. Clashes each week told a chronological narrative, and each event pushed the threshold for violence. The summer started with tear gas, and as the events escalated during those weeks, I wondered if I was going to watch someone die on the timeline. Infinite scrolling. Crowded around a television store on a side street in Samsoibo one evening on one of my nights volunteering, I see a group of protesters pause, transfixed by large curved HD monitors broadcasting a live feed of police tear gassing other protesters elsewhere on Nathan Road. As if suddenly stirring from a daze, one of the group urges the others to keep moving. Change your clothes or change location. There's no point in lingering. You can watch the live stream from home later. Salty Wet is an oral history of tears. It is the name for the insurrectionary spirit and its perspiration, of its vulgarity and its spectacle, on the ineffability of living. The following is a text as profane as the times we inhabit. This is not a love letter. The following is a hellish scroll. And then just I invite Virgil to come on with his screen.
Hi.
For those of you who have seen Hell is a Timeline before, I usually don't talk after those readings, which are approximately the same duration. So I'm a little bit exhausted from doing that. Okay. Hi. So let's talk about the design.
Yeah, I was reminded that maybe to go already off script.
Yeah.
Well, here, I'll share my screen. We can say a little bit on script. So
Yeah.
we made a little presentation of Tiffany and I being cute.
Also over a very dreadful thing that it's very strange to return to this, by the way. Like, because I am
yeah.
Oof.
I mean, it was really incredible to hear you read from it. And it's funny, I was thinking a lot about how working with a text in design or in a design application is like a kind of cruel situation, because I had like read drafts of it, but when I don't know, it's always hard to fully read something as you prepare to design it, because you're like, oh, I'll be looking at it so much, and then you just kind of develop this certain way of looking where I just like seek out certain kinds of text to make sure that all the in this case that all the censored text is properly rendered as redacted, and all the Chinese text is properly in Chinese and not as a missing glyph in English and things like that. So it's a real privilege to hear it. But I was reminded of that I wrote about you once, before we even worked on the leaked one, and I quickly brought that up, and I remember one thing that you made me think about when I was watching your Instagram stories about the protest that you're describing and what you read from, that I just the thing that I always thought was that that line of the internet is a vast system designed only for forgetting.
Right. Yeah, I actually thought about that a lot, actually preparing for this talk. But also the way in which like I switched from in this text from like third person and first person. I hope to the thing that I'm trying not to do, I mean, that I fail, if I use the first person as a way to center myself in these texts, but the first person is really used to provide scale, I think, to try and provide scale for people. The first person is the most compelling. So I think weaving this through the third person voice of history writing, kind of like LARPing a historian. I love that. My parents are getting like a spam call right now. That there is this way in which living through an event like this and living through multiple events that we all are around the world we're constantly having to sift through different altitudes of time. So that's why also like this text, I can kind of like reweave it. Anyway.
Reweave it. Yeah. And I think, because I think in that little bit of thinking about your Instagram mediation of it, I also thought a lot about how kind of in between these, because I'm privileged enough to be on your close friends list. And so occasionally in between the pictures of like kind of a horrifying update on the day's events, there'd be a picture of maybe not even necessarily your dog, but a dog.
Right. Yeah.
And that like, and that I think already in the kind of, what I like about the register changes in the book, and also beyond, you know, there's, or the changes in texture of the book, is that it kind of also reflects, I think, the way that you lived in the present with all this material that you're covering in it.
Yeah, and like live archiving it, what you're talking about with like so I guess for the audience who doesn't know, who doesn't follow me on Instagram, for the past or a year, I guess, during the protests, I was doing these like Instagram stories of just screenshotting and reposting the news, which is just a matter of like live archive, but then they disappear in 24 hours. So you, Virgil, wrote about like for your master's, I think, like history master's, wrote about like the internet and the history of forgetting, or like the internet as like this vast archive of forgetting. And I think that there's this illusion that everything lives on the internet forever, but there's so much that also disappears too. Let's talk about the design of the book. Let's go in it.
Yeah. So I thought, just as a kind of full disclosure, full unveil. So I first got to help with this project with the leaked version, which is what was alluded to in the introduction as the kind of first event almost a year ago, which was, which I don't know. I think I was thinking about what to say and I feel very unprepared, but I think it's important to say that you are like, you're a very good friend, but you're also a very good client. Because you're really, I feel like when I'm lucky enough to work with you, it's a nice balance between you're excited to see what I come up with and how I respond to the text that you're offering, but also you have a very clear idea. But that idea that I don't think is like you want it to look like a certain thing, but you have like an idea about the like ethics of the publication. And I think that with the ethics of the aesthetics, maybe, or something like that. Like I remember like the clearest decision is being a good little designer, I prepared files for print, and the print files always have crop marks on them so that they could be cropped and cut to size. And you made like a really, kind of quick but clear decision to keep the crop marks in and to not cut it down, which I think is something that came up when you were on site working with the printer. But that kind of, this kind of attention to process was something that was very clear to me, and what made it fun to work on creating a printed object with you. But then it's something that, as you alluded to in the reading you did, like is a really big part of this process. And as
the funny thing about you bringing up the crop, sorry to interrupt you. The thing about you bringing up the crop marks that's so interesting is that the decision-making process was also partly done with the printer, who was at the like machine itself, and whom I was speaking with in Cantonese. And I was also there with Ming Lin, who is also part of like various projects in Hong Kong, including formerly Holy Motors and Distribution Assembly, and then and Shanzai Lyric. So I mean, basically, we were looking at this thing that had just come fresh off the print, and the printer, the guy was just, he's like in his 40s, late 40s, 50s, like a I guess like a Hong Kong diaspora Chinese American man, you know, like they're just looking at this thing. He was like, the kids probably want it with the print, without the crop. You know, this is the cool thing that they do. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to listen to you. Let's just go with it, you know? So that was that decision, actually. That was why it was also so swift. It was like a kind of process of being with these two people at the printer, including the printer themselves.
Yeah, I guess to be clear, so this one was printed in Queens at Linco.
Yes.
Whereas the leak was printed in Queens. The full book was printed in Hong Kong. You know.
Yeah, which I describe, yeah.
Which is again kind of a late decision that kind of I think revealed the project at the end.
Right.
But my favorite thing about working on this project was not actually something that I directly contributed to, but your other amazing graphic collaborator, which is the calligraphy that's on the cover on the front and back cover of the book, and then throughout as kind of a running title. And maybe do you want to explain these sides?
Yeah. So Jonathan Yu is someone I commissioned for the calligraphy. He is a Hong Kong artist, and I should probably tell people his Instagram because I feel like people really should follow his work. It's really incredible. And he just, also being a cultural studies person, he just really understood the kind of ethics of what I was trying to write through. I'm going to actually just partly read from his description. These are actually slides that he put together for this talk. It's like 7:52 in the morning right now in Hong Kong. So thank you also to people who are tuning in from Hong Kong. It's really lovely that you woke up early for this. But he shared this with me. So I had shared the draft of the text with him just for him to understand where, you know, what its contents were. And I'd kind of given him an idea of what it was. I met him at like a zine book fair kind of situation. And he was just trying to think about like what gang sup is like, you know, very, or like even salty or even wetter. That's like the literal translation. So, and he, you know, and he intuited, which is very on point, this idea of like salty, wet being like a sort of like beyond the concept of like taste physically. There, he describes emotional expression of identity and and my perception of those events. And salty and wet, and playing with that also in the brushwork was important to him. So he plays with this the ink density and the wetness of the brush. So you'll see different iterations of like the wetness showing itself. You know, even using the expressions of like the bars as different options for the text itself. So I mean, it was like a really, for some to be seen like that, like I talked about that at the very beginning, but like to have my work be seen like that by another zine maker in Hong Kong, you know, one who's like quote more local than me, and having that meaningful for me was like a very meaningful exchange. And also for him to get the kind of like the ontology of like wetness and humidity that is part of like Hong Kong and like the experience of Hong Kong, that was really potent. And tears, it's the idea of tears. And so what we ended up kind of ending on was this I guess it's in reverse, but if you go to one of the, if you want to scroll, Virgil, to one of the other slides, and I see some questions popping up, so I promise I'll get to them. It almost looks like CAPTCHA font, because I really like fake CAPTCHA, or I like try to make fake CAPTCHA because it's about this kind of typeface that asks you if you're human, and is this sort of like ability to evade the detection of a computer. And so the mirroring of that with that kind of like messy, jagged edge, like cover, and then the back, which is very wet. This is using very wet paper to kind of blot out the characters. That play, he just got it. He just like totally understood the text itself. And I'm very grateful to him for expressing the text through calligraphy in that way.
I think from and for me, it was really helpful because, you know, I was very privileged to have you kind of explain all this kind of subtleties of translation and what it means differently in Cantonese versus in English. But I think it wasn't really until I saw the kind of way that he kind of wrote out this kind of particular meaning, and then obviously with your help to understand it, that it kind of began to click, and I was like understanding what the title really meant. And I just
Yeah. And
I
for
really
me,
love the wet brushing one is just so good.
yeah.
And there's like a stain on the back page.
For me also, well, one thing I'll say before I go into the like meaning of also having a kind of interlocutor, like a visual interlocutor like him. And this cover that you designed, Virgil, we were matching the color. You had matched the color of this to like the pavement in Hong Kong. So like in the vein of, I don't know, under the pavement, there is a beach, sort of like protest. The idea of like taking up bricks and things like that, the ground is also part of the understanding of Hong Kong in anyway. And then the second thing was, I mean, I was also nervous for him to read it, because what if he hated it? And what if he thought it was a horrible text that he found offensive, or, like the audience that I'm most nervous to upset is the Hong Kong audience. I don't really care about any other audience, no, I'm just kidding. But but you know what I mean? It's like, this is a text about Hong Kong. It would be terrible as a person of the diaspora who's like already kind of, a floater in some sense, and with the privilege to leave also. What does it mean? Who are the legitimate children of place? And how do you speak to each other as part of the same community, but varied community? So anyway, and then you should talk about the redaction or the thick line in the middle of the text that you created, which I love.
Yeah, I think it came very early in the process, and I think for me, I chose this first screenshot because the text came to me as Google Doc, and I was thinking very much about, okay, so it's going to be a book, and then so much of what's really beautiful about the way that Tiffany writes is it includes these redactions and you're very good about always writing them and not just like, oh, put a black bar of this text. Like if the text is already removed, it's like unreadable. It's just a series of rectangular glyphs. And I was thinking a lot about that redaction and basically how, when you set up a book document, you always have to, think about the way the binding will hold the center of the spread, and how that kind of, you have this kind of dark valley that things fall into. And so then to kind of, to make that more emphatic and make that a part of the plan. And then it kind of, I thought what was nice about it is, for me, it was this very simple thing of like, okay, the middle of the book is always dark, why don't we kind of make that more emphatic and then take the form of the black bar of redaction. But I think when I shared it with you, I think it very quickly became a much richer thread, and kind of other kind of metaphorical links to like to the delta, and also to kind of the potential pornography of the book. And that
the centerfold, which is the Pearl River, the map of the Pearl River Delta. So I mean, even thinking about like the spine of the text as a kind of, so I call the Pearl River Delta the cunt of globalism, the birthplace of it. And in some ways, this also is a kind of double reference to the centerfold, the spine itself being a center, a center fold, literally. And in the dark valley of the kind of cunt. Okay. Anyway, I love that you did that.
And I think, and then the kind of the other component that I wasn't sure how it would work, but I think seeing, especially watching you read it tonight, like that, because the dark stain in the middle goes all the way to the edge, it's also the kind of a way of, in my kind of, not wet brush, but kind of, oil-based ink printing that I was controlling remotely with my computer to kind of make a stain and a bleeding in the same way. So I think, which is really,
Yeah.
in the incredibly digital collaboration that we have, I have yet to see the book physically. So this was like, I felt like my most intimate evening with the book, and it was so nice to see it, closer to real life. But I think it really, I'm glad that worked. That like really, I think also, which is an idea I had before, and then when we had this kind of fuckery with the binding, it became kind of really, really important. Which was not like the crop marks wasn't planned, but then was like a, it was waiting for us.
Yeah, I mean, the redaction is also this idea, Pamela M. Lee writes, the secret is itself. Pamela M. Lee, the art historian who works with, like, I have the book somewhere, but it's on like redaction and the aesthetics of redaction and redacted documents and things like that. The secret is itself an ideological contrivance, she writes. Its withholding, its visible withholding, is as critical to its power as whatever content we imagine it conceals. So I'm definitely really interested in that. I see some questions, and people can start populating with questions, otherwise we'll just keep rambling. I'm just gonna read this. I love the earlier demonstration of the kind of one-sided opaqueness of the Mylar cover as an external emergency material. Then listening to you talk about the blotted out calligraphy feels like a very interesting duality. This is more an observation and not really a question. Thank you. And if you had any thoughts about it and or intentional, it would be cool. It would be cool to hear. So yeah, I mean, yeah, just as I was saying, I think this ongoing kind of interest in what redaction means, the sort of ethics of redaction, the ethics of redacting people whom I quote, the ethics also at the end where I have an acknowledgements page, which I get consent from people to thank them. So ways of exposure and redaction, and even my own name, I think in the first Salty Wet is redacted. But in this one, it is not. I've been thinking about the sort of toggling of opacity. Glissant obviously talking about the notion of the right to opacity, but also Akbar Abbas, a Hong Kong cultural studies scholar, talking about Hong Kong as a culture of disappearance, which he wrote before all of these particular events. I think like in 1997, 1998, late 90s, that book was written. Someone can correct me if they, but recently the new book about Hong Kong demonstrations called Appearing Demonstrations. So there's something else happening right now that it's just in terms of exposure and appearance becomes the kind of becomes a matter of doxing yourself with your, or exposing yourself and putting yourself on the line. So there is an inherent kind of like danger and politics and ethics of that, as, in terms of thinking about authorship. Thank you, 1987. Okay. Thank you, Chen.
I think we also with the book, we decided that it shouldn't begin with the title page, that it just kind of begins. And also careful viewers will notice that your name does not appear for a very, very long time in the book. It's there, and it's very much like evidently your authorship, but it's not on the front or the back, and it begins, there's no, you just open the book and you open the scroll and you start reading, and then it resolves itself at the end.
The other thing that I want to say, I guess, so this is the first publication of Speculative Place Press, which is a fourth, I think we have a few other things this coming year. Scott Chan, who's a Hong Kong artist and ceramicist with a practice on drawing on receipts. And then another collaboration with Sasha Fires Burgess on an upcoming book, thinking about in relations across like post-colonial perspectives between Trinidadian communities and my perspective from the Pearl River Delta. And then also publishing an anthology of various writings called this is a working title, by the way, Earthly Delights, an anthology of gardens in the age of the apocalypse by Danny Wu. So, and then Virgil, you and I have something as always in the mix called Thirst Politique on the Power of Shame, Leaks, and Image-Based Sexual Assault. So exciting about that. How would you like something like distribution work for this book in Hong Kong? That's a great question. A DIY distribution network of people handing off books, like friends of friends. So that's how it's going to work.
And eventually, maybe someone will eventually leak the PDF.
Yes. Well, its quintessential form is a scroll. So I'm currently working on this as a scroll, like a small edition, a small run of scrolls, which to be announced soon, what that is going to be and where that is going to be shown. Right. Well, which is why, I think the very fact of it being redacted in this particular way, I wrote it with that in mind. But, I don't necessarily, I think some of the most contentious parts of what the law does or does not say, which is inherently open-ended, the things that it explicitly states, again, I'm going to talk in legalese as much as possible, is that this text intentionally shadow boxes, but it is also certainly not something that poses any kind of like political solution in any way. If I did have that, I'd be a political pundit but that's not the goal here. If the goal itself is to sort of open up the notion of archives and to rip apart and to take the sort of to open up the possibility of many different types of archives and illegitimate archives. I think it should be apparent in the way that this text exists, especially with its redaction, that it comes out of that culture of the law that it speaks around.
The way you're talking also reminds me of my favorite of your Instagram posts, when you have to post a new story, reminder, I am not a journalist.
Right.
I am just, and that I think that stance of I am just doing this, I am, and denying a kind of professional point of view or claiming a goal, I think is an important way that you relate to the political situation.
Yeah, and I also rely on my own obtuseness because this is obtuse. I don't know. It's not very straightforward. But then, yeah, certain actions that are being clamped down on are, but I don't. Next question. Yu Chen writes, "Dear Tiffany, thank you as always for hurting me. It hurts so well. A question, how does it feel to read it from the USA? It feels really strange." Also, first of all, the air is dry here. It is so dry. I have humidifiers going, and yet the air is still so dry. This is the most palpable sense that it is not Hong Kong that I'm in. But I'm in my parents' place right now. Yeah. So dryness, it's super dry. It feels, I honestly also last week with all the events that were happening between Hong Kong and here, and also the relationships between where people were relating the attempted coup to the storming of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, which by specifically by right-wing Hong Kongers, that was really strange and disorienting, but is also something I talk about in Too Salty, Too Wet, about these compounding timelines, these simultaneous apocalypse, the sort of compounding timelines of crisis. which happened during, in 2014 during the Black Lives Matter movement then, which was simultaneous to the Umbrella movement in that same month, months of framing were concurrent to one another. So it is surreal to be back and to see from across the looking glass what the news looks like from here. But it is also as more people move out of Hong Kong, I think I keep thinking about that. And also what this as potentially a trilogy also means, and a third installment.
I don't like that. I prefer our time zone alignment when you're in Hong Kong.
Yeah, me too. I guess I'm going to ask myself some questions if no one's going to get into it. I also can't tell how many people are on this thing. Oh, wait, hold on. I do see 5. Oh, there are more questions.
Everyone's
Oh,
still here.
Karen Chung, who's a former Speculative Place writer and has an upcoming book from Random House, by the way. Thank you for your reading, Tiffany. Can you please share your personal definition of belonging? Wow. And how it may be similar and or different to longing for a place. Oh, wow. It's really hard to answer this question. Well, I like that you can break apart belonging, and longing exists inside that word. And I think that, I don't know, I think it's a series of accidents that make us belong to a place. It's a series of accidents that led to my family belonging to Hong Kong. More broadly, we're probably better categorized as Chinese diaspora. My dad speaks 4 Chinese dialects, and so I think we have a very complicated place to Hong Kong, which Hong Kong itself is complicated because it has 2 vectors of diaspora, many diasporas going in, and then many diaspora, and then diaspora going out as well. Elvia, can you talk more about the trilogy? How could it possibly get any more salty and wet? Well, it's like chemistry, isn't it? It's maybe I'll talk about salting the ice. I don't know. Yeah, the third one is I'm still thinking about what it is, so I don't want to give it away, but I think it'll be in length kind of similar to the second one and probably not return to the first one in format. Margaret Stern, redaction. I recall that with the home cooking performance, you tend to pixelate your face. Did you consider that for the stream? I do show my face for talks because I think it's important. Those are performances, like you're saying, so there's something about that. I also I'm reading other people's work, so I just in the Hell is a Timeline performances, I want to decenter myself from that. I just want to use myself as an antenna. And of course, there's some of that here, but yeah, I'm interested in what you said. And Margaret, again, I'm interested in what you said about your use of the first person to create a sense of scale for the reader. How did you arrive at this decision to use a written POV style? I mean, one thing I thought about, especially when I write about the spectacle of terror, so many other people say it better, Sadia Hartman, Evan Calder-Williams, or even The Pain of Others, Susan Sontag. It's I'm writing about this particular thing, but what was so strange for me, and also the thing that I felt was that I wanted to put on paper somehow really comes from how to live through this time, which demands us to constantly code switch from multiple different altitudes and multiple senses of time to structurally understanding these events, to emotionally understanding these events. And these are not compatible ways of understanding the same thing. So for me, the first person was the most critical way to unsettle that kind of potentially too objective tone or something. But then again, history writing was the most essential way for me to understand even my own family history. Okay. Okay. Oh, lots of questions. Okay. Sorry. And then Rosemarie. Hello, Tiffany. Inspired by your comments that attachment to Hong Kong was not simply that of a lover or parent, and that you once said that you wanted the text to be unfuckable. How does opening up new archives and therefore new lineages, not parental, relate to this unfuckability? Whoa, that is quite a question. That's a really good question. I'm just trying to digest it. Unfuckability. Trauma, as also being a transgenerational thing between a parent and child. You know, I think I was taught a lot of my father's trauma, and he was taught his, and he was adopted, and you don't have to have a bloodline to inherit those traumas. Obviously, trauma is inherited through many other ways, parenting. So I think when I think about the lineage of trauma and the lineage of, and opening up the archives, it's also about opening up oral histories for my own family. And frankly, setting that just as an example to just encourage other people to continue to feed the archive through like our own oral histories that I think are tantamount. These stories in the process of disappearing have to be told by the people who live them. Eileen Ramos, great reading. What books are you currently reading? What underrated books would you recommend? Oh man, well, what do I have right now open? Well, I'm about to start Haunted by Empire and Laura Stoller. And I don't know, is there, I think like a really easy way to do that is The Hell is a Timeline bibliography. Those are on the Home Cooking Instagram and also on their Vimeo channel, and they're also archived as Google Docs. So I excerpt a lot of texts that I think are really important, and I kind of assemble them into a thematic reading. So those are great books that that have really informed and helped me in the past year and make sense of things. And then the other thing that I'm reading is New Materialisms, Ontology, Agency, and Politics. This is that, and from that, Sarah Ahmed's essay, Orientations Matter. So, anonymous attendee, thank you so much for your incredible and difficult reading. Tiffany, I'm thinking about your comment at the beginning of the book and how you wanted the text to hurt because you were hurting. It reminded me of something Grace M. Cho writes in Haunting the Korean Diaspora, which is about the figure of, sorry if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Yang Gongju, a derogatory term used to describe Korean sex workers catering the US military clientele in camp towns, in which Cho writes about trauma, but also describes how part of her project in writing is to traumatize the text itself. I would love to hear you speak more about the relationship between affect and politics. How might saltiness and wetness create a prefigural politics or different kinds of community? Well, salty and wet, salty, wet, and Too Salty, Too Wet. These titles are, well, specifically Too Salty, Too Wet is about the excess of the times and also secretion. It's about sweat, but it's also, in it, I also write about being exposed to tear gas so much that I have an IUD and I stopped getting my period. So it literally stopped this like regular, it triggered my periods again. I do not get my period through because of my IUD, but the tear gas exposure and the toxins, which has been written about for other places as well, has definitely, I thought a lot about bodies and secretion and illness and the toxic levels of violence, and toxic levels and violence in the ways that create secretion of our bodies. So Too Salty, Too Wet is about crying. It is also about my uterus responding to the events as well. I didn't know about Grace M. Cho's work, and thank you so much for suggesting that. I'm also really inspired in terms of thinking about translation too, inspired by Don Mi Choi's text, which I think, Virgil, you introduced me to. Translation is a mode, translation is an anti-colonial mode. Yeah. So, and thinking about, she writes about the idea that interpretation is a political act. that we're able to arrive at this perspective because of the knowledge that not only our lives and struggles are interconnected, but our languages are also interconnected by histories of imperialism, colonialism, and militarism, by increasing economic interdependence. So I really like this idea of the idea of translation as opening up multiple archives that otherwise sit in silos because of language, and allows you to see these cross-cultural connections, I think and to restore this kind of critical connection across the front lines of struggles against authoritarianism is like the most, that is also the too salty, too wet, the bad translation. You just have to kind of shuffle from one mode to another. And writing this text about Hong Kong in the English language, it is a bastard text also because of that. Ricky de Lavaga, sorry, I'm pronouncing these names incorrectly. Sorry. Hello?
Tiffany, I was also going to say one thing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is it working? Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think you discussed that, you also have intentionally partial glossary in the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
And then throughout the book kind of offer some translations, some transcriptions, but also refuse to do that kind of beyond actions.
Right.
Which I think is part of like how, that like it's not, I think just to be kind of clear about the material impact of what you're describing is you made these really clear choices through the text. But I'm also reminded of when we were adding a few note pages at the end, and you showed me the kind of Chinese character reading paper for when you learn how to learn Chinese, and I like mocked it up to include pages like that, and your response was like, actually way too like disciplinary for me, way too intense to include these sorts of pages. And so also like I think because I think which reminds me of like inclusions of these like feelings of translation and the violences that are implicit in that, but also I think I don't think that the book is therapeutic for you in any necessary, but like I think you are working, you did draw lines with the text and you kind of worked it out, and I think quite clear ways. Throughout it. I just wanted to share that. Sorry.
You were saying something also that another person had raised, the question of Emily Bovino writes, hi, by the way, glossary. So yes, this begins actually with a mostly blank glossary. I got really fucking sorry. I guess I can curse on these things. I got really tired of of having to translate for people the events that were happening. I write about how people were congratulating me on the shelving of the extradition bill, and constantly having to tell the events, even though there are people and a whole industry around telling the events, and yet I was like constantly living this like weird spectacle of like the perversion of these events as this thing that I was living alongside of, and having to clarify between misinformation and disinformation. And lawfare, that's a big question. Lawfare. I mean, me writing a text about that is long. It's basically a text of fine print. The assaults of lawfare that happen in Hong Kong are myriad, and I don't really want to go too much into that, but sort of let the book speak for itself, because also due to time. But yes, lawfare is a really, really critical way in which like sort of death by 1,000 cuts, paper cuts. Irene Sue, thank you for this performance and reading. I appreciate how you framed first person as a way to provide scale, and was curious how you see this alongside the body as a camera, as you've talked about in Chen's world. Would love to hear more about your thoughts on writing v cinema as aesthetic, effective decisions of recording trauma, processing grief, and cataloging accidents. Yeah, I think our bodies show trauma and record trauma. And a lot of this book was about reckoning with how it showed it, not just in my body, but also like collecting, my friends and what they were saying around me, and people around me who were also experiencing somatic symptoms. Ricky, sorry, I'm going to go back to your question. How do you think about the overlapping boundaries of and between your printed work like Too Salty, Too Wet, Salty Wet, and your film like Never Rest, Unrest, and the relationship of both to the internet? Yes. The internet is this incredible archive of, also to quote you, Virgil, this archive of forgetting. So I'm really interested in also how people can be anonymous on it, even citing tweets on it. I think MLA asks that you cite tweets by people's actual names, which is ridiculous and doxes people. So I'm just really interested in the ethics of like the internet and how, and different channels of information. So between, you know, the film and also the print work, they are ultimately about kind of thinking about the channels and the distribution channels of information and how to kind of, how to mess with that and what is the shortest distance to communicate. And I did, you know, I wrote Too Salty, Too Wet simultaneous to making Never Rest, Unrest. And those two films, those two things are ultimately about the spectacle and the politics of the spectacle. Hera, your detailed IG stories of tweets and article clippings provided very concise digests of the day-to-day political life of Hong Kong in 2019 and to 2020 for both people familiar with that and what was going on. This work, which reminds me of your recent film, Never Rest, Unrest, is very much more of an intentional audience. Where does the impulse for this shift come from? Again, I think it's like looking at what channels of information I'm communicating through. So each kind of has a different consideration of its own. And thank you for that question. And hi. And the other thing too about that is my advisor in college actually wrote this book. Robert Culp wrote this book, Power and Print in Modern China. And this sort of like the creation of the civic body through print and publishing. So that text is really, really influential on my work and my thinking about different modes and channels of kind of political creation. An oral history of tears. Whose tears do you put in that history? Is class-related category or not restricted by class, but to everyone in Hong Kong? Yeah, I write certainly about different, between the people whom I'm around. I have a full-time job working at in logistics, and I work, so I hear different things and through work and also being in like art spaces as well, but also through the internet. And also a lot of this stuff is also through research methods like via the internet and like LIHKG and like Twitter and stuff like that. So no, it shouldn't be restricted to class. In fact, I think the thing that is the most perverse about Hong Kong in some ways, and I love the city, but the thing that is often misunderstood about it is that it is this like sort of idea of like a kind of global metropole. It's not metropole. Metropoles are usually the sort of not colonies. You know, metropoles by definition are not the cities of colonies. They are like the kind of like in the part of the empire or like in the center of the empire. But Hong Kong almost has that like appearance of a metropole because it is a financial hub. But what happens, I think, most is that the forgotten histories are often the people who are who suffer under the sort of like underbelly of Hong Kong and class and the disparate and the deep disparity in class that drives and continued to drive so much of the protest actions in Hong Kong. So I hope that answers your questions. I hope, but there's only, crying is a very private thing. Some people do not like to share with others when they are crying. So broadly, it is about sorrow, and it is about different types of sorrow, and which I talk about also through my great-grandfather, who I described was a coolie. Any time left to talk about the sculptures beyond you in closing? Don't know what. In relation.
Your friend, the cop.
Oh, yes, the cop. Hold on. From Chris, in relation to NSL, which has a guiding impulse of control and delimitation of speech, expression, being, can you talk more about what role excess plays in Too Salty, Too Wet? What about excessive perversity, which was bigger focus on the part of the trilogy? Yeah, in it, I talk about protest tourism, people who flew thousands of miles away to gawk at what the protest was. Dark tourism actually did happen, and I saw a lot of it. The excess of the times was also the excess of the gaze and the intensity of the gaze while everything was happening. But it wasn't as though, since we had more witnesses, people understood things more. There was more mistranslation, more misunderstanding, and people trying to negate our lived experiences or other people's lived experiences. Yeah. Sorry, I'm really going through these really fast because I just am mindful of time. But yeah, the scroll itself is forthcoming, so to be announced soon what the actual scroll, which is its quintessential way to read this text, is supposed to be. Any other questions? I think that's it, right? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. I can't tell how many people are on this, so I'm just speaking into the void. Oh, should I just close on? I'm just going to close showing the audience something. So this is a thread-bound scroll, which is what it was supposed to be. Like this. It's very like thin tissue paper, but this is actually about the news. This is my dad, so I have to be very careful with it. It's like these beautiful illustrations. Oh, one thing I did want to say about the class question too, I think in terms of thinking about graffiti, those are also authorless and very potent sites of offering an oral history of tears. There's this one that everyone remembers, 7K for a house and you think I'm afraid of jail. That one was very famous in the protests. So this sort of global disparity sort of like cooks frustrations for people in an unlivable place. The Hong Kong is unlivable in so many different ways. Any other questions? I think that's it. Here's what it was supposed to be, but isn't, so. Oh, and then these figurines. This is too symbolic. This guy, Zhong Kuai, he catches ghosts. This other guy, Guan Gong, yeah, he's like a military guy. Complicated. He's a symbol of justice, but also in police precincts in Hong Kong, they use him as kind of a symbol. They have him in a lot of police precincts. My parents don't have him for that particular reason, but yeah, they don't like cops.
But it's also, I was thinking about it after you told us this before we started. That the ghost catcher and the cop is like the perfect, like embodiments of doing this on Zoom. It's the ghost catcher and the cop.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Necromancy. Speaking to the dead. All right. Thank you so much, everyone.